In the beginning of this age, many of the High Elves still remained. Most of these dwelt in Lindon, west of the Ered Luin. But before the building of the Barad-dûr, many of the Sindar passed eastward, and some established realms in the forests far away, where their people were mostly Sylvan elves. Greetings and well met, my friends. Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be continuing our Timeline of Arda series that has finally made it to the beginning of the Second Age. If you are new to this series, please check out the preceding videos in this timeline and playlist, which come from the beginning of Middle-earth to this point in the Legendarium, and those videos summarize a great deal of the Silmarillion. Today we are going to get our story established of the early Second Age, which of all the ages has the most recorded years, and many events spread out over those years. However, even though the Second Age and its events are quite important, the years of the age are not quite as dense with events as are the years of the First and Third Ages, so we should be able to cover the main events of the Second Age in less Timeline of Arda videos than we did with the First Age. But as for more specific information, I'll link some related and helpful articles in the description and cards above. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. After the sundering of Beleriand and the migration of Beleriand's denizens, either to the realm of the uttermost west or to Middle-earth, new realms were founded and established. In the past few Timeline of Arda videos, it was clear that Beleriand was quite dangerous because of the servants of Morgoth the enemy. But now he was gone, cast out beyond the walls of night, never to return to this world. However, his greatest servant Sauron fled the justice of the Valar and hid in Middle-earth. But he would not be a threat for quite a long time in the Second Age, so new lands, peoples, and kings were allowed to be established and to thrive. In the first year of the Second Age, the elves founded the Grey Havens and the region of Lindon, in the land that remained from Osiriand, once predominantly populated by the Green Elves. The region's borders were the sea and the River Lune in the east. This is where High King Gil-galad, son of either Orodreth or Fingon, depending on what canon one chooses to believe, made his kingdom. He would be the last king of the High Elves, the Noldor, and his was the last true kingdom of the High Elves in Middle-earth. But there were other elves who had come from Beleriand that were not of the Noldor, but rather were of the Sindar and of the kin of Thingol. Some such as Orifer and his son Thranduil, as well as Amdir and his son Amroth, were not of the kin of the Noldor, and for many reasons notwithstanding the conflicts of the First Age, they desired to rule themselves and other Sindar. They would come to places such as Greenwood the Great and Lindorrenand, later called Lothlorien respectively, and they would establish their rule in those places, even ruling over the Sylvan elves who lived there. So for many centuries in the Second Age, most of the Sindar and Sylvan elves lived on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, while most, if not all, the Noldor stayed on the western side during that time. Galadriel of the Noldor and her husband Celeborn of the Sindar would rule the mostly Sindarin elves in Gil-galad's name in Harlindon, before going on to live near Lake Ninuiel with some of the Nandor in Evendom, and then in Eregion when the Noldor went there, but we will talk about that more in a bit. In terms of men, the middlemen and other men of Middle-earth would continue dwelling in their lands wherever they had dwelt before. But concerning the remaining men from Beleriand, the Adain, they were granted gifts of long life, wisdom, strength, and others by the Valar, for their deeds in the fight against Morgoth during the First Age. And the greatest of these gifts was the island of Westernesse, Númenor of old. The men who followed their king Elros, the brother of Elrond Half-Elven and the son of Eärendil and Elwing, finally reached Númenor in 32 of the Second Age, and their way to the island was guided by the Star of Eärendil, one of the Silmarils of Feanor. Elros became Tar-Minyatur, first king of Númenor, and his rule was long and grand, as the new realm, and the greatest realm of all men, was come. These men became the Dunedain, or Men of the West. As for the dwarves, those who remained in the ruined and old cities of the Blue Mountains, were Firebeards and Broadbeams, for it was their kin who had built Nogrod and Belegost, left their mountain homes, and migrated to Khazad-dûm and integrated themselves with the Longbeard clan around the year 40. These kingdoms thrived for many years, and the darkness of the previous age had abated for quite some time. This was perhaps the longest and greatest peace Middle-earth had seen since at least the Siege of Angband in the First Age, or even the imprisonment of Melkor during the Years of the Trees. But time wore on, and Tar-Minyatur would finally pass away in 442, being 500 years old when he died. But still he was a man, and the gift of men is an inescapable doom. But these were during the wise years, when kings knew that their times came, and they did not try to overcome them in unwise ways, like later Númenóreans would attempt. So his lineage also went on, as did Númenor, and for many a ruler after him, wisdom and friendship with the elves would still be common in Westernesse. However, not all evil in Middle-earth was gone, and around the year 500, Sauron began to stir again in Middle-earth. In 548, Silmarillon would be born, and since Númenor had not yet progressed enough to let women be the rulers, as the island would eventually do, Silmarillon would still go on to found an important house with her husband Elaton, the royal house of Andúnié, members of which would eventually become the leaders of the faithful men of Númenor. King Tar-Elendil created the title the Lord of Andúnié for his grandson, Velondil, son of Silmarillon. Tar-Elendil also gave Silmarillon the Ring of Barahir, rather than keeping it in the line of kings in Númenor. I imagine he also gave the sword Narsil to her line if he had it, rather than to the next king as well. And so the lords of Andúnié, while being kin of the kings and queens of Númenor, were established in their own right, and would have political power, and would be counselors and advisors to the royal house. The members of that house would acquire other heirlooms besides Narsil and the Ring of Barahir throughout the age as well, such as the original Elendilmir from Silmarillon, the Scepter of Andúnié that would one day be the Scepter of Annúminas, the Palantiri of Amandil from the Eldar, and the sapling of the white tree that Isildur would steal during the Dark Days. In 600 of the Second Age, the ships of Númenor appeared off the coastline of Middle-earth, as the Dúnedain ventured further in the world. Turning back to the elves of Middle-earth, in 750 of the Second Age, Celebrimbor, the last heir of Feanor that yet participated in the deeds of the world, led some of the Noldor to Eregion, on the western side of the Misty Mountains, for they had learned that Mithril was discovered by the dwarves in Khazad-dûm. Being of the Noldor who were great craftsmen, and not of the Sindar who were once betrayed by dwarves in Beleriand, they became great friends with the dwarves of Durin's folk. Indeed, the friendship of the Longbeards with the elves of Eregion was the greatest friendship between dwarf and elf, at least until the friendship of Gimli and Legolas. The elven city of Ost-in-Ethil would be created, and Galadriel and Celeborn would dwell there for a time, before Galadriel and her daughter Celebrian went on to Lothlorien. But Celeborn would stay as he wished not to cross through Khazad-dûm, and still had great animosity against the dwarves, being a kinsman of Thingol. But during that time great crafts were accomplished, such as the doors of Durin, made by elf and dwarf together. And in a legend it is said that Celebrimbor crafted for Galadriel, whom he loved, a second Elisar stone, after the first had gone west with Eärendil. And if that legend is true, that would be the same stone to come to Aragorn in the Third Age. Aldarion, the heir to the kingship of Númenor, and a mariner would journey to Middle-earth as well. However, around the year 1000 of the Second Age, Sauron began to take notice and alarm of the growing power of the Númenóreans, and so he went to Mordor to create his stronghold and fortify his power. Thus he began construction on the Barad-dûr. But Gil-galad even knew before this time that a shadow grew upon Middle-earth, and had sent word to the Númenóreans through Prince Aldarion of this dark foreboding. Life in Númenor would continue as the island and its people were strong, and eventually Tar-en-Calame would be the first ruling queen of Númenor in 1075. Finally, in 1200, Sauron took on the guise of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and an emissary of the Valar, for he attempted to seduce the elves to bring them to their demise. But the wisdom and farsightedness of Gil-galad and Elrond made them refuse entry to Annatar into Lindon, so Annatar went to the Noldor of Eregion and won them over instead. In that same year, Númenóreans began to make permanent havens in Middle-earth. Annatar and his students among Celebrimbor and the other Gwaith I Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, honed ringcraft for centuries until around the year 1500, when their skill was at its height, and they began the construction of the Rings of Power. At a time when Annatar left Eregion, Celebrimbor and his smiths forged 3 elven rings around 1590 with what they knew, and were thus unsullied by Sauron, though these 3 rings were still outcomes of his teachings and were subject to the Master Ring. And so once 7 rings went to the dwarves, given to them either by Sauron or Celebrimbor. As there are competing stories, 9 rings were given by Sauron to men, 3 of whom were Númenorians, and 3 secret rings went to the elves. Sauron made his 1 ring around the year 1600 in Orodruin, or Mount Doom, and Barad-dûr was completed. When Sauron wore the 1 ring and his voice was heard, the elves knew they were deceived and took off their rings, and they were sent far away, to 3 of the greatest elves of that time, Galadriel, Círdan, and Gil-galad. Sauron, who revealed himself and his subtle plans of tyranny to the elves, was enraged, as he had not known about the elven rings, and thus he made ready for war, as he would attempt to do what his master could not, defeat the free peoples and conquer Middle-earth. But that is where we will pick up in our next Timeline of Arda video. From this part of the Timeline of Arda, we see that when there is peace and happiness, we must enjoy such things while we can, for they may not always last. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of the Timeline of Arda. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about this part of the story? Let me know in the comments below. I'm excited to learn more about the Second Age as we continue our journeys together, as it's interesting to see how many places, people, and stories we know from the Third Age began. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for our podcasts and Discord server. Links are in the description below. Royan and I just did a podcast for our patrons over on Patreon, so please check that out. I want to shout out our Valor Tier patrons over on Patreon: Adrian De La Tour, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Kyle Wetzel, Lane Grimes, Samuel McBee, Jonathan Putnam, and Mark Kralik. Thank you guys so much. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I will see you all again next week with a new What's Different video as we finish out the Two Towers book and movie. Everyone, as always, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.